The work that I do, I think, is why I'm here. I think it has less to do with something about me. I love it, and I'm really passionate about it, and it's very interesting work. I decided about a year ago that legal aid was something that was going to be a big part of my life, and I thought, what a wonderful thing to do, to take off 6 months minimum and go and start and run a public defender system in a foreign country, especially in a third world country. The experience helped shape sort of my appreciation for how good we have it here. Every day running around and hustling in Brooklyn, you can sometimes lose sight of why you're doing this work. The challenges that we face day to day in Brooklyn are tremendous. The over-criminalization of minor offenses is a huge one. Our clients are getting arrested for walking down the street or riding a bicycle. Our clients are getting arrested for sitting on 2 subway seats. Our clients are getting arrested for walking through subway cars. And what we're basically doing in Brooklyn is preventing police from harassing mainly minorities, mainly poor people within a very selected area. The New York Times in July of 2010 came out with an article talking about, over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, there have been 50,000 police stops within a 2-block radius in Brownsville, Brooklyn. I don't know if some of you may have read that. And it's an interesting idea. I didn't grow up in Brownsville. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I grew up in a place where I never got stopped by police. I was riding my bicycle on a sidewalk, and I never had that sense of police presence until I came to Brooklyn. And so a lot of what we do is try to assist in making sure that citizens of this country, and even non-citizens of this country, get to live in peace and not get harassed by police. And so what I decided to do was, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. Why don't I switch it up, and why don't I go abroad, and why don't I try to start a public defender system and sort of step back from this all and see what's the point of it. Why do we do what we do? And going to Nepal, a newly democratic nation in the foothills of the Himalayas, became a democracy in 2008. No public defender system there whatsoever. And going there and starting a public defender system, you get to think about the macro level reasons why we even have public defense to begin with. And so it was a nice way to sort of recharge the batteries a little bit, even though it was kind of tough to live there, just on a practical level. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. There's no electricity 12 hours out of the day, and it varies from day to day. It could be from 4 to 6, and then 10 to 12, and then so you never know when the lights are going to be on or not. And it was also somewhat physically toxic. There's a lot of bacteria there. I came sort of right at the height of the monsoon season, and so I got quite sick while I was there. And so it was a bit of a sort of a personal challenge, but what I saw there was quite incredible. I saw a new system that, while there are many, many setbacks, a system that is eager to change. I would have loved to have gone back to the beginning of our system in the United States and to see what it was like 2 or 3 years after this, our country became a country, and to see what kind of legal system there was. And that's what I was doing here in Nepal. And so as I was fighting and filing writs of habeas corpus petitions and doing all of this, sort of supervising, I never lost sight of the fact that this is a new system, and in relative terms, quite progressive in terms of their desire to have basic human rights. And the other thing that I thought about as I went through this experience was I never really thought about what I was doing in the context of human rights. I mean, it is human rights, but until I came to Nepal and I saw that people were sitting in jail for years, 7, 8, 9 years, without a trial, without a lawyer, just sitting, just rotting away in a prison, it became less about like due process and the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments, and just basic stuff that we should all be entitled to. And so I really am excited about the fact that the human rights organization here has sort of linked this up, and what a great idea to bring the two things together, because public defense is human rights. Whether it's in Brooklyn, in Brownsville, or whether it's in Kathmandu, Nepal, it really is about what we should be entitled to. The Constitution doesn't say that you're entitled to all of these things if you're rich, or if you're white, or if you're innocent. It says that you're entitled to these things regardless. And so the experience of coming to Nepal really reinvigorated my sense of purpose, made me appreciate why I do what I do, and it also made me feel how lucky we have it here, even though it's sometimes hard to remember that. I prepared some photos. Some are sort of substantively related to the work, some are not. I wanted to give you guys, does anyone know what the password is here? I wanted to give you guys a sense of what Nepal is like. Have any of you ever been to Nepal? No. How many of you are first years, by the way, just so I can get a sense? And second years? We got two. Any third years? Yeah, we got a couple third years. Good. So I prepared a bit of just a slideshow to talk to you about, to sort of help sort of explain what I was doing there. And I think it's sometimes much easier to see visual things instead of just talking about it. But let me tell you a little bit about what exactly I was doing. I decided in May of 2010, I think I got it. I think I'll figure it out as I'm talking. I think I can do two things at once. We go to computer, and then perfect. I think we're good to go. I decided in May of 2010 to take a 6-month sabbatical, and I applied to the International Legal Foundation. The International Legal Foundation is a nonprofit organization that goes into newly democratic countries that have had a history of conflict, civil war, fighting, and all that kind of stuff. And they believe that as part of any democracy, poor people, when they're arrested, should be entitled to legal representation. And it's a wonderful idea that it's not only building democracy and promoting rule of law, but also establishing systems so that they become self-sufficient. And so what the International Legal Foundation does is it goes into newly democratic post-conflict countries. It shadows the lawyers who are there, learns the system, and then brings in practitioners from the West to supervise the lawyers, to bring them up to speed on the quality of the practice that we want to have to zealously advocate on behalf of people who are accused of crimes. And then after about maybe 5 years or so, we leave. And then they're self-sufficient. They started in 1994, I believe, in Rwanda, and started Legal Aid Rwanda. They then moved to Afghanistan and have one of the most impressive international public defender systems there. They then, in 2008, went to Nepal, and that's when I got involved. And as we speak, they're opening up an office in the West Bank to represent Palestinians who are accused of crimes. And so it's a great sort of way to sort of, go out there and do something completely different. At the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn, every 3 years, you're entitled to a 1-year sabbatical. Your job is still waiting for you when you get back. And so I thought, after 5 years of trying cases in Brooklyn, I thought, oh, this would be kind of nice to do something along the lines of this. And so I left in May, and I arrived on May 3rd in Nepal during the height of a nationwide political struggle between the Maoists and the rest of the country. The Maoists are communists, and as I arrived the first day, there was a hammer and sickle on the floor, and the whole country was shut down. No businesses were open, there were no cars on the street, and it was an interesting time to see Kathmandu, because what I had read about Kathmandu was of a very populated place, and as I got there, everyone was inside, there was isolated violence in the city, and it was an interesting time to be there, especially when I was going there to try to help start and continue a public defender system. And so what I saw when I got there was streets that were just empty with people walking around, but it did get me to sort of appreciate the quietness of this place and the beauty of it in a way. There were a lot of stand-ins And the political struggle really had to do with the integration of the Maoist army into the newly established army for the country. And the people who didn't like Maoists didn't want Maoists being members of the army. And so that was really the sticking point. When I arrived at the time, there was only an interim constitution in Nepal. There was no actually finalized constitution. And on May 28, 2010, there was supposed to be a final constitution vote. It never happened because of the lack of compromise between the two major parties. And so what we saw was an extension of that interim constitution at the last minute for another year as they hash out big picture issues. I was there not only during a sort of new democracy and without a public defender system, but also without really any sense of a constitution. There was a lot of meetings we had about discussing, should we have federalism? Should we have these big issues that we didn't, I don't really sort of think about as I run around Brooklyn and sort of take for granted as I go to law school. So these are the big picture issues that I was dealing with, as well as just representing people who are accused of crimes on a day-to-day basis. The police were a constant presence. They kept their distance at time. Nepal is 70% Hindu, about 25% Buddhist, and 5% I think Muslim. And relatively peaceful throughout the week-long strike. Some of you may have read about the strike in May. And so I arrived at a very interesting time and saw some unique things that I wasn't really expecting about this country. And so when I did arrive, there was obviously a big UN presence there to keep the peace. When I arrived, I saw a much different system than I was used to in Brooklyn. In Kathmandu, there is a district court, there are a number of appellate courts, and there is a Supreme Court. One of the interesting things about the problems, and I'll go through some challenges later about the system there, was that the Supreme Court was a court of general jurisdiction, which meant that anyone can apply to be heard in the Supreme Court. And that backlogged the heck out of the system. You know, I mean, there are really, really big issues that we need to have the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, deal with. And if you've got a land dispute or something like that, you can file it with the Supreme Court. Just as a side, another issue that caused a lot of backlog was there was no plea bargaining system. If you get arrested and you admit to your guilt, you still go to trial. And so that caused a huge backlog at the trial court level. We are now just starting to encourage the government attorneys, the district attorneys, to negotiate with us, to kind of like in a civil way, a summary judgment. If there's not enough to go forward, dismiss the case. But it really was a challenge in that sense. So I arrived in Kathmandu, and I saw a district court that was a lot different than the Brooklyn one for sure. Common types of crimes in Nepal. Theft, a huge one. Drugs, mainly heroin, they call it brown sugar. Some hash, a little marijuana, sort of decriminalized to a certain extent. Human trafficking, a big one. A lot of movement in between Tibet and India. A lot of sex crimes related to the human trafficking. A lot of arms and ammunition, a lot of arms coming in through India. That was a huge type of case along the western part of Nepal. Nepal is nestled in between India and Tibet, and so a lot of flow of arms in between. There was also a lot of violent crime as well, a lot of robberies related to theft, and a lot of murder. We tried a number of cases where our clients were charged with murder by poisoning, which was kind of an interesting type of, means to kill someone. Usually in the States it's a little bit more sort of advanced than poisoning, but there, when you're really, really poor, how else are you going to try to kill someone, I guess, is with poison. But we had a number of interesting cases that I've never encountered before. If you kill a cow in Nepal, because it's Hindu, even though it's secular now, 12 years. And I'll show you some pictures about this. I started a project while I was in Nepal. There was a huge, huge outcry against poaching. The Royal Chitwan National Park contains, I think, the largest number of rhinos in Asia, and they're dwindling fast. And my clients, the indigenous people, were being hired by the poachers themselves who benefit from the one horn of a rhino. And were being arrested and being thrown in jail for years, and, without any due process whatsoever. It was all over the news, it was on the radio. And so our organization decided to go down to the jungle jails of Chitwan and start interviewing clients. And so for one day, and I'll show you some pictures, for about 8 hours, I met about 120 people who had been sitting in jail for quite a long time without ever seeing a lawyer, and interviewed them and decided to take on 25 of them as our clients. We filed writs of habeas corpus arguing against the illegal detention of these clients, and it made a lot of headway, but a lot of problems. No one really wanted to back up people who are accused of poaching. Judges in the appellate court heard our arguments, and we were pretty good on the law. The Constitution says you have a right to a speedy trial. Within 1 year, if you don't try the case, there's no remedy, but something should happen. Here in the United States, when the case goes beyond the time that it should be tried, it's dismissed. We weren't even asking for dismissal. We were just simply asking for release until you actually try the case, because there's so few lawyers there. It's so poor there that the idea of trying to ask for dismissal, I think, is overreaching. And so one of the things we had to try to do as we were running this office was to think about a remedy that would be appropriate, and not simply think that, oh, speedy trial violation, let's dismiss the case. And so for the first time ever, we had an appellate court in Hitauta set precedent that said, we're not going to release your guy, because if we released everyone who had speedy trial violations, I think the whole country would get released. But what we had happen was the court said for the first time ever, trial court judge, you have 90 days to try this case, or we're going to hold you in contempt. And so for the first time ever, the appellate court said there is a right to speedy trial in Nepal. And so we are now seeing a lot of decisions made quicker, and in cases where there is no evidence, people are getting out for the first time. Some people arrested. This is Beer, one of my attorneys with whom I work. Behind Beer, you can see this is the Kathmandu District Court. This is the holding cell during the day when clients come in. You can see there's a tree that is growing through the holding cell. And Mohan, you can see one of my other clients, you'll see a picture from later on, is interviewing one of our clients who was charged with attempted murder. He was working at a bar. His friend got in a fight. He came in to defend himself, to defend his friend, and then he was charged with attempted murder. And so we took on his case, and we were successful in getting an acquittal for that trial. We went out and investigated, spoke with witnesses, and we gave this guy what we believe he's entitled to, which is just zealous representation. His name was Bikram Giri, or his name is Bikram Giri. He was charged with attempted murder. This is what our folders look like. Everything was written in Nepali. I don't know a lick of Nepali. I had to have an interpreter with me 24 hours a day. And while my staff basically spoke English, when it came to the legal stuff, everything was in a completely different language that had to be interpreted to me. If you and I were working on something and you needed to write something, you would write it in Nepali, my translator would translate it, I would edit it, he would translate it back, he would write it again, and it was quite a slow process, and I had to get used to the idea of things not happening as quickly as I would have liked. But it also made me sort of appreciate the fact that I was here as a foreigner, and this was not my country. And this was someone else's country, and I had to appreciate the cultural issues that I don't normally get exposed to in the States. For instance, a caste system that I've never been used to before. You're born into a certain caste, and you are sort of told that this is what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. And so I had to sort of get used to some of these ideas. Women aren't treated very well in Nepal. It's a sort of repressed environment in a lot of ways, and so we had to sort of understand those cultural limitations, especially in the context of the law. Bigamy is a very interesting type of trial that we had to trial a number of times, and just the general cultural things was another fascinating thing to be a part of. Arranged marriages are huge in Nepal. My interpreter, you'll see a picture of him in a second, met his soon-to-be wife for coffee on a Tuesday and married her the next day. 31-year-old guy, never dated anyone before, and married his wife. They've been married now for 3 or 4 years, happily married, and it's a very different system than it is here. So when I came there, I was very excited about learning not only the new system, but also to teach them a little bit about our system. There's Bikram Giri on the right. So this is the district court. This is the lowest level trial court right here. These are people held in a van, a jail. There's Mohan. You can see on their heads they wear topis. I was given a topi by Mohan when I arrived, and the topis are simply formal wear that they wear oftentimes in court. And Mohan and Veer always wear one. Mohan wears a black one, which is a little more formal than Veer, it's a little bit more colorful. This is the day that I got my hat. I was really excited about embracing the whole, tradition. And so, common theft, motorcycle theft. A lot of motorcycles got stolen. Motorcycles are a huge means of transportation in Nepal, and so these are the motorcycles that have been recovered, that are sitting in the district court that just gathered dust. One of the problems that I encountered while I was there, and that they were actually working on before I got there, if you were charged with, say, a crime that warrants a fine as a conviction, so let's say I'm accused of stealing a motorcycle, and I get convicted of stealing that motorcycle, the judge can impose a fine. And it's typically the value of the motorcycle. So let's say it's $1,000. Nepal established 25 years ago a way in which if you're poor and you can't pay that fine, you can be credited per day 25 rupees towards that fine. Now, unfortunately, that value was created 25 years ago. So what's happening is people are getting convicted of stealing a motorcycle. They're using the present day value of the motorcycle fine, $1,000, but only crediting you 25 years ago value per day that you sit in jail. And so we filed a public interest litigation motion with the Supreme Court saying we're not opposed to you jailing people to pay the fines, even though there's, I think, a lot of due process issues with that, and I think there's been a lot of litigation about that in the United States. But if you're going to do it, at least give them the value. So 25 rupees is about 30 cents. And so you are sitting in jail paying off stealing a $1,000 motorcycle at 30 cents a day. The present day value, I believe, of 30 cents is about $2, which is still, I think, quite meager, but at least is a little bit more, it gives you fewer days in jail. So we filed the motion. The Supreme Court said we're not listening to it because we want the legislature to deal with this. We then filed another motion saying, hey, here's an example of where you guys stepped in before the legislature. So they're now chewing on this issue. We met with Ministry of Justice people. We said, listen, this just isn't fair. So these are the types of things that we were working on while we were while we were there. This is the Chitwan project. I went down with Rakesh, who's to my right, and Guneshwar, who's my translator, to my left. This is the jail in Bharatpur, which is the town right near the jungles of Chitwan, and went down there one day, and one of the interesting things about being in Nepal is, for the first time, I was very clearly the minority. So I went down there and saw for the first time the reaction of Nepalis seeing a white person. They thought that I was there with the wildlife conservationist to try to impose additional sentences of torture. How much time do you get if you're charged with not even shooting the rhino, just say having a piece of meat in your refrigerator? Zach? 15. Minimum 5, max 15. All right? We're down there. These guys thought we were trying to increase the punishment. So we sat in this jungle jail. Guneshwar is reading their paperwork, translating it to me and Rakesh, and we're asking them questions as to whether or not they're eligible. Have you had a lawyer before? When were you arrested? And one by one, hundreds of guys came with their old pieces of paper, handed it to us. We found out there were people who were sitting in jail 5, 6, 7, 8 years without a lawyer, without a trial, in direct contravention with the interim constitution. You have a right to a lawyer from the time of arrest in Nepal. You have a right to a speedy trial. And while on paper the rights are robust, in practice what we were doing was trying to bridge the gap between what you're entitled to and what you actually get. So we went down to the jungle jails and we started interviewing people for about 8 or 9 hours. We determined that 25 were eligible for our representation. We went back to Kathmandu. It was a 5-hour drive through the hilly mountains, and we filed these writs of habeas corpus. A week later, we were in Hatauda Appellate Court in front of 2 benches, arguing for the first time ever on behalf of these poachers. This isn't right. We don't agree with poaching, we don't think it's a good idea, but if you guys claim to be a democracy, if you claim to actually have a constitution, give people rights that they're entitled. And that's all we want. Human rights, not human rights, but wildlife activists were there. The warden of Chitwan National Park was there, and this is actually a very interesting thing. Who do you think is the judge in these poaching cases? The warden of Chitwan National Park. Who do you think is the police in these poaching cases? The warden of Chitwan National Park. Who do you think is the prosecutor in these poaching cases? The warden of Chitwan National Park. He has to not only run the most intense national park in the country because he has very limited resources, he has to protect these amazing animals, by the way. I saw rhinos for the first time, and they are prehistoric, and they are amazing, and they're the most beautiful creatures I've ever seen. We rode on elephants through the jungle to see these things, and while I find them incredibly beautiful and some of the most amazing animals I've ever seen, I thought that this isn't right. And so we had an interesting time with this poaching case. What happened was the warden decided to do the following. The warden was told by the appellate court that you have 90 days to try these cases. And so what did he start to do? He just started to rubber stamp convictions. He wouldn't do any witness examinations. He wouldn't do anything else. He said, you know what? I have so much political pressure. This is such a high-profile thing. I'm just going to start convicting these guys. And we had meetings with him, and we started to have him at least slow the process down, give us a little bit of time to actually give these people due process. We just recently won, for the first time, we challenged the bail that he set in one of the cases. And the appellate court overturned it, got the client released. And so, since I started, about 10 of the cases have gone to trial, and we are continuing to work on them. And when I say work on them, I'm talking about going in a 4-wheel drive, driving through rivers, finding some isolated little village in the middle of nowhere, speaking some indigenous language with them, taking photos of where they say they found this meat, trying to gather witnesses, doing some pretty basic grassroots level investigation for these people. And that's all we were trying to do, is just give them what they were entitled to. After a while, it was getting so loud that they allowed us inside the jail. The conditions weren't that great, needless to say. And so we spent about 8 hours that day. And every week I would come down, I'd either fly down or I'd drive 5 hours, and I'd update my new 25 clients as to what was going on with their case. It was a pretty gratifying thing to just walk in. And the day that we argued the appellate argument, it was on the radio. And when we came down afterwards to tell them, we've got a shot here, they had already heard. They had already played it over the whole jail. 250 guys were listening to this thing. And it was a pretty gratifying thing to actually, for the first time ever, give people due process that they're entitled to. Here's the national park sign. TB was a big problem for elephants. I didn't know that elephants could suffer from tuberculosis, but they had quarantined this elephant. And that's why you see the chains on him or her, and trying to get the elephant better. Amazing animals, by the way. In Chitwan, it's the low-level plain of the northwest. It's called the Terai region. A lot of rice growing, so you get to see. This basically is the way of life in Nepal. As you drive around, this is what you see everywhere. They plant each rice seed by hand, and you just see these amazing rows of lines of rice, and it's some of the most amazing stuff to see how hardworking they are. These are some wise men in Kathmandu. You can see they're wearing what you would call tika. It represents different things. It's ceremonial. It can mean that you're getting married. It can mean a lot of different things. This is Bharatpur. This is the town right outside of Kathmandu. You get to see a little bit of the architecture here. It was my birthday while I was there. Here's the office. Here are the attorneys. We were supervising. You can see Melissa Deneen in the back. Melissa was my colleague. She had run the Micronesia Public Defender System for 2 years. Prior to that, she was at the Philadelphia Public Defender's Office for 10 years. And she and I were people who were running this program. There were about 10 lawyers in Kathmandu. There were 2 lawyers in Janakpur, which is close to India, that we were supervising on Skype, which is quite interesting. I hadn't used Skype much before. We would have CLEs on Monday mornings, continuing legal education, where we would get to teach them whatever we wanted. There was a New York Times article about confessing when you're innocent. So we had a whole talk about that. It was an interesting exercise because a lot of these lawyers, very dedicated, very into due process, had a different view of clients who confessed in court. They thought, all right, well, if he's confessed, I guess my job stops here. And what we started to teach them was, listen, your job has just begun. It's a very easy thing to represent someone who is innocent. It's a much harder thing to represent someone who's factually guilty. And so we started to have them think about their roles in this whole system. Each attorney gets paid no more than $400 a month. And that's a pretty good living in Nepal. We had 2 interpreters. While I was there, you'll see some pictures. We had the opportunity to scout out new offices. We opened up another office in Nepal Ganj, which is some of the hottest areas of Nepal. We had 2 lawyers go out, and now we have an office for the first time ever in Nepal Ganj. While I left, we were opening up another in Hitauda, where we had filed the appellate court argument on the speedy trial issue. The Nepal Ganj team, right when they got there, walked into the jail once we set up our office. They found 5 clients who had been sitting in jail for 2-3 years on BS. Filed writs of habeas corpus. Within a week, we had released 5 people in Nepal Ganj, which is a pretty satisfying thing. The downside to a lot of this progressive stuff is that sometimes it's not taken very well. We had done the same type of work in Janakpur, where there are a lot of arms and ammunition cases, and guess what the police did once we were successful with our writs? They denied us access to our clients. Can't come to the jail anymore. If you're going to come in and interview our clients and file these pieces of paper, they thought that we were trying to point them out for doing no good. They thought that we were trying to say, you were bad people. We weren't there to do that. We were just trying to give you what you're entitled to. They denied us access to speaking with clients. And so for months, we would meet with the heads of police in Kathmandu, in Janakpur. We came out there and had conferences, and we said, hey, listen, we need some way to have access. We needed some way to at least give these people what they're entitled to. And so slowly but surely, we are convincing the system that if you guys truly believe that you are a democracy, you have to have defense attorneys for poor people. And so they're just starting to get around to this idea. We dance when we sing the cake. Just some cool crafts, some interesting people. Interesting type of diversity in Nepal because the country is nestled in between India and Tibet. You see people who look everything from more Indian, a very darker brown skin, to more Mongolian, more Asian looking, and so very interesting. It's a mother with her child. Sorry, it's stretched out, but he's praying. Outside of Kathmandu, I don't know how many of you know, but the Himalayas are in Kathmandu, and Mount Everest, among others, are there. 7 of the largest 10 peaks in the world are in Nepal, and it's some of the most amazing scenery I've ever seen. It's kind of tough to get out there. There's only one highway to get out there. If there's a landslide, if cars break down, and that happens all the time, you're stuck for hours, if not days. People sit in traffic jams for days. wait. It taught me a lot about patience, being in Nepal. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to give a lecture. As you can see, this is a room full of the appellate and Supreme Court justices of Nepal. And I was able to, I'm up at the podium, at the table next to me is the chief of the appellate court, Natalie Ray, who's the executive director of the International Legal Foundation, who's also a colleague of mine for the Legal Aid Society, and the Appeals Bureau, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court next to her, and the second in command. And I was giving them a talk about ethics. They have 2.5-page ethical sort of treaty in Nepal. Since the enactment of their ethical rules, there hasn't been one disciplinary action. There hasn't been one complaint formally lodged. And so I talked to them about the type of system we have here. And when you do that, you have to do it in a way that you're not trying to tell them our way is better, especially in the context of our sort of, the last sort of Iraq war and all that kind of stuff. We have to be very sensitive about how we come in and say, hey, listen. And so they were very, very interested with how you become a lawyer in the U.S. They asked lots of questions about the courses that you take in law school, the training that you get, and I talked to them for about a half an hour about a number of different issues. And as a result of that, they wanted us to write some publications in the Nepal Law Journal. So we wrote a publication about ethical rules that we should consider in the context of criminal defense. For instance, a big debate at this lecture was representing co-defendants. They don't have that many lawyers in Nepal. And so when 2 people or 3 people come in with the same charges, a judge expects you to represent all 3. And so for the first time ever, we had to explain to them why it could be problematic to represent 3 people who are charged with the same thing. And so they're just starting to now get around to the idea of different lawyers for each client. So it was quite interesting. This is our office that we opened up in Nepal Ganj. CK, our office manager, is to the left. Veer, if you remember, and Rakesh. These 2 lawyers have been practicing about 10, 15 years. They left their home in Nepal Ganj, which is a 15-hour drive away, came to Kathmandu without their families, trained with us for a year, and came back to their families. And were dedicated the whole time, and now are the 2 people who have the opportunity to really do some amazing work out in Nepal Ganj. For the first time ever, giving people access to zealous advocacy. It's a mother and her daughter, and a monkey. I did it with the monkey. Let me talk about a few of the other problems quickly, and then I'll talk about some of the interesting progress that we made there. Corruption, you may think, is a big problem, and it is a big problem, but it's not as much of a problem for my clients as you would think, only because we are representing the poorest people, and so they don't have money to pay the judges or the police. But it's quite a rampant thing that occurs there. Many of the judges have no legal training, like with the warden of Chitwan National Park. He had not once had any type of legal background, and so was deciding these cases, trying to apply law in a context that he didn't have much familiarity with. So there were certain things about this experience that were shocking. There were other things about it that were quite encouraging. While I was there, we won a huge motion at the Supreme Court saying that you can't keep juveniles in adult detention facilities in contravention of a lot of international law. Very big issue for us. And it was interesting because our focus, while it's in public defense, we were embraced by the international community in many ways because we were on the ground doing the work. And especially the juvenile NGOs and INGOs that were there, they really wanted us to be part of a lot of the talks in terms of writing laws for the Child Rights Act and all of these other things, because we were the ones who were advocating on their behalf in the context of juvenile justice. We had a number of statutes that required automatic detention without bail, which is in violation of the Constitution. We got those laws struck down while we were there. We had, for the first time ever, I mentioned the speedy trial recognition. We also had, for the first time ever, the recognition of a client's right to remain silent. Before we had gotten there, you get arrested, you get brought in front of the judge makes you speak. And even before you get in front of the judge, the police are probably doing some level of torture, something, and getting you to confess in front of the police. So for the first time ever, we said you have a right to remain silent, and so the confessions that we were having the prosecutor present in court were getting thrown out by the police because they weren't advised of their right to remain silent. And in court, for the first time ever, we were able to invoke their right to remain silent, and so for the first time, and we were citing Miranda. It was a pretty interesting type of thing to sit in this court and say, in the U.S., this is what we have, and you should consider it. Discovery, getting the paperwork from the prosecutors was quite an interesting uphill battle. We had a number of decisions made while we were there, forcing the prosecutors to do what they were required to do. We also established for the first time ever, we are contracted by the Judges Society of Nepal now to train all public defenders who are court appointed. Before, there were these lawyers who were assigned to a criminal case, typically after the indictment was filed. And in Nepal, this is a really weird thing, and I wish we could change this. From the time of arrest to indictment, you have about 25 days. And in those 25 days is the only time you can do any investigation that's admissible at trial. Once that indictment is filed, no more investigation can be done. And so what they were doing to our clients was they were assigning lawyers once the indictment was filed so that no investigation could be done. And so what we're now doing is we're having these public defenders who are being appointed for the first time ever having to go through a licensing training through us before they can come be public defenders. And so for the first time ever, I think we're going to be increasing the quality of the practice while we were there. Martin Luther King wrote when he was in Birmingham, Alabama jail, he said, the injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So this work that I was doing in Nepal was a pretty cool thing to bring the sort of fight that I had from Brooklyn into the jungles of Chitwan National Park and do some pretty amazing work. And at the end of it, while there were some very difficult things just physically about it and I was tired, I come back to sort of the Legal Aid Society now with a very renewed sense of why we do this work. Let me talk to you a little bit about legal aid, and I'd like to then try to answer some of your questions. As many of you know, I've been a public defender for a long time in Brooklyn, representing poor people accused of crimes. Zach and I have been in the same office together for now for 2 years, and I'd love maybe if we have a few minutes for Zach to come up and maybe talk to you a little bit about what it's like to be a first or second year there so you can have a different sense. Day to day, what I love about this job is two things. One, the first thing is that I feel like I'm less judgmental towards human beings having done this type of work. I believe wholeheartedly that people are genuinely good people and that we don't really want to do bad things. I would say almost all clients that I meet in the context of the criminal justice system either have a mental health issue, have some sort of addiction issue, or because of poverty or some other circumstance are committing crimes. No one really is just a bad guy at heart. Whether it's child molesters or murderers or whatever, when you sit down with them and you talk to them and you ask them, if I could snap my fingers and make you not addicted to heroin, if I could snap my fingers and make you have less of a proclivity for raping little girls, would you want to be normal? Would you want to be a good human being? And they all say yes. And there are a lot of things outside of their control that I don't think people recognize in the context of criminal justice. And so I think we feel really good about the type of work that we're doing because we believe that these people are good at heart, and they are. And so as a result, I take as a big gift from this whole experience the idea that we are good people, and that I don't feel like there's anything sort of bad about who they are. How do we defend guilty people? Quite easily. To us, there's no issue about guilt in the same way that the ER doctor operates on whoever comes into his ER room because he takes an oath. we too represent everyone. We also don't know oftentimes whether they're guilty or not, and then I would also just simply say in the context of guilt, there's a big difference between being factually guilty and legally guilty. Oftentimes people will be sitting in their homes, police will come in without a search warrant, they'll find the gun under the bed, so they're factually guilty, but they didn't come in with a search warrant. And so where we come in is to sort of just to say, hey, listen, we're not condoning that you have a gun, but you can't just run into people's homes without a search warrant. So it's a little bit nuanced perhaps, but for me, I couldn't care less whether they've done the crime or not. In fact, the more sort of heinous it is, the more guilty they are, the more I want to help them, because that's when you really test the application of these rights. And so it's a very interesting challenge to be a part of, but it's something that I love a lot. The second thing that I love about this job, and I've talked about this before as I come down here, is that the stakes are quite real. The result of our work means saving someone's life. I can't think of a cooler thing to do with my law degree than that. I think when you all were applying to law school, I think very few of you were writing your law school essays about making a lot of money, and sitting at a desk in a law firm working 15 hours a day. I think a lot of you talked about changing the world in one way or another. And I've got to tell you, for what it's worth, if this is something you're considering, you should, because the idea of walking into a courtroom and fighting on behalf of someone's life is the most interesting type of motivation in the world. And it's so redeeming to see a client get out of a chair, having sat in jail for the last year and a half, and see him hug his family for the first time, where he's looking at life in prison. And you see him start a new life again, and you see him grow up and kick his addiction, and you're like, wow, I had something to do with that. What makes it even more gratifying is that he's not paying me. And there's something sort of pure about that. I think it's a really neat thing that clients in Brooklyn get to have lawyers like Zach for free, who just run around and hustle on their behalf. And it's because the system provides that, that we get that. And we, the taxpayers, have to pay for that. There's always something new as well. I have a trial right now that Zach and I are working on. Wilfred Dexter is a Haitian 24-year-old with no criminal record. He was honorably discharged from the Navy 2 years ago. He was living in an apartment in Bed-Stuy, and a 22-year-old white woman moved in for 3 weeks. Everything was all right, copacetic. They went up to a barbecue on the roof and had some drinks, and everyone was getting intoxicated. They came back downstairs. They had sex. She claims that he forced her to have sex with a gun. No gun was ever recovered. She had a boyfriend at the time who was calling her that night, and where are you, where are you? She never picked up the phone. The next morning, she calls him up, tells him that she had sex with Will. She takes a shower, she goes to work. No injuries, no nothing, no witnesses. Will's at home, 15 police come, guns drawn, throw him to the ground, kick him around, bring him down to the precinct, say, we're going to make this a federal case if you don't sign this confession. We'll let you go if you sign it. You're going to be in so much trouble. And this kid with no criminal record, who's never seen the inside of a precinct before, writes out a 10-line confession. We've hired an expert from John Jay to discuss this new phenomenon of confessions by innocent people, and it's quite a fascinating thing. When you're promised leniency, coupled with threats of punishment, and you're innocent, you're more likely to sign something that you didn't do. When you're innocent, you think, oh, if I sign it, they're saying I'm going to go anyway. The system will take care of itself. The truth will set me free. And so for the first time, we are now litigating the Brooklyn Supreme Court to have this expert admitted to talk about this to a jury. Most people understand that in identification cases, you can pick out the wrong person. But the notion of an innocent person writing out a confession when they didn't do it is a much harder thing to sort of swallow. And I bet you a lot of you, if you thought about it, would say, there's no way I'm signing that thing. It happens more than you think. And so for the first time ever, we're going to litigate this issue. Will is sitting in jail right now. I just got a call from his mom this morning. We're going into the community right now trying to raise money to get the $10,000 get them out of jail before the trial starts. I like my clients not in jail ever, but especially during a trial, because jurors see them during lunch breaks, and it humanizes them a little bit more. Will's been sitting in jail for a year now because he can't afford the $10,000 bail. We also do a lot of mitigating damages in the context of plea bargaining. We do a lot of sort of deals with the Brooklyn DA's office to try to say, hey, listen, why don't you, he'll plead guilty if you give him this. We are the most innovative court house in the country in terms of alternatives to incarceration, which is a very interesting thing. We have a lot of mental health courts, we have a lot of drug courts, and so it's a very nice sort of way to address this issue of incarceration. Separate from my own sort of personal views and my experiences, incarceration doesn't work to deter crime. It makes people more likely when they come out to do bad things. And so our country incarcerates more people than anyone else in the world. If we just started to think about ways in which we could address the underlying mental health, the addiction issues, I think we would get a long way to ensuring that less people committed crimes. What you can do in terms of the opportunities, I would say a number of things. One, I would say, I looked online, there are a lot of international internships. Go abroad for the summer. Go work at the International Criminal Court. You know, go to The Hague. Go work in Kenya. Go do something that is like Lawyers Without Borders. There's Lawyers Without Borders now. And a lot of my friends who are doctors go abroad, and I got to tell you, they say it's the most rewarding experience they've ever had. I would take a lot of the international law classes and the human rights classes and all that kind of stuff, but I would really try to reach out to some development programs. USAID, my father worked for a number of years. The United States Agency for International Development has a number of very interesting rule of law projects that you can go onto their website and start to apply for. The Center for Constitutional Rights, the ABA, all have large presence in not only in Nepal, but a lot of these developing countries. And so you can do some really, really interesting work while you're there. The UVA and federal loan forgiveness is actually quite robust for you now. I sat down with the Director of Financial Aid yesterday and determined that I make too much money to get any more loan assistance. I make $70,000 a year, and I'm over the amount that can get assistance, but I was getting a lot of assistance for quite a long time, and so it's quite robust. So to the extent that you're worried about not being able to afford doing this type of work, I'd say that there are a lot of systems in place now to encourage that type of work. The Legal Aid Society, in the case you're interested, is hiring a lot of interns for the summer. The New York State Legislature just filed case cap legislation for the first time. What that means is no longer do I have an unlimited amount of cases. They are capping the number of cases that we carry to about 100, which is still a ton. I had at some moments 35 indicted felonies, like Will's case, 35 of those, and then another 100 and 115 misdemeanors. Needless to say, there's a lot of sort of triage that you have to do. And so now, for the first time ever, the legislature said, Gideon entitles you not only to advocacy, but zealous advocacy where they're not overworked. And so we're hiring a number of lawyers now to fill in the sort of the new funding that's being provided.